Hello on Saturday afternoon, May the 13th, I believe it is. I just want to comment for a few minutes today on some topics, several topics actually, that I'm going to try to kind of pull together and make a general point about. And then each of these topics is worth investigation on their own in the future. But the kind of the context, as I've been thinking over the last couple of weeks, watching different news stories about different topics, the baby formula, Ukraine, what's happening and not happening with our government, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that struck me is the degree to which perhaps uh, we are seeing people who are being taken advantage of, for lack of a better way to put it. People with good intentions, good ideas, trust, who are in a system that is not necessarily trustworthy. And one of the Before I go too far down that road, like the title of this is, at the moment anyway, context matters. The degree to which we're operating with systems and ideas in a world that no longer reflects the context in which those systems and ideas were developed. This isn't the third century, this isn't the first century, this isn't the 15th or even the 18th century. To which we harken back with the founding of America and so many important writings and thinkers coming together around the founding of America in the 18th century as a history of Western thought. Many ideas that we point to today and is central to our understanding of how life functions, how we ought to function in life, kind of coalesced in that period. And yet, many of the institutions that were established, many of the ideas that were put into practice through various laws and policies are perhaps no longer able to function in the world as it is today. There's just been massive changes in the way the world is and the way human society is in the last 250, 300 years, and the degree to which we are continuing to try to operate as if we are in the world of 1776 or even 1876 is a failure to recognize that the world in 2022 is very much different. And the same, some of the same, many of the same, perhaps even all of the basic philosophical issues and concerns that were addressed and that formed the context in which many of the, again, applications, policies, institutions that were developed. Many of those ideas may in fact be true, but it's no longer a world. The world of 2022 is not the world of 1776. And so, and in some ways that's good, in some ways that's very good. But in most ways, we simply need to recognize perhaps that it's time to adjust our expectations, particularly of government, of ourselves in relationship to government and community, and recognize that perhaps some things are happening that are outside of our control because we've let go of control or refuse to exercise control or try to exert control in order to maintain a society in which the ideals we are striving for can actually be attained. And so some of the things I just want to mention, stories and topics and discussions and a few names about people I've been watching some videos on and hearing talking about some of these things that you can look into. And again, as with all that I say, hope that you'll have time to respond and point me to other names and other videos and ways of thinking about these things to help us all kind of come to a better way of thinking and acting, because that's really my objective with all this is, what ought we to do and how can we do that, not just what's wrong with everything or what's right with everything, as if we can fully identify everything or all that's right or wrong. But one of the things that's in the news today immediately is the baby food crisis. And it's a symptom, perhaps, of some things that have been in the news for several months, such as the supply chain and the integration of the world economy that came much more to our attention in the course of the pandemic, but also some things that have come to our attention. One thing I've not looked into or heard anything about recently is the degree to which the harbors were afraid the ships is being unloaded in harbors and put on trucks and shipped around the country, how that situation is. Are there still 100 plus ships sitting in the ocean waiting for access to a dock? What is going on in that situation? Well, I do know one of the things I was surprised to hear about, if I understood and heard correctly, was that dock workers were being asked to work around the clock. Now, I didn't realize that the docks, if they are limited in number and if there is a backlog, especially, weren't working around the clock. The degree to which we perhaps would assume that in not only if there is a need, but if there's an opportunity to make money and to increase return, that a business wouldn't respond to that, but that it didn't, or at least as I understand it, again, it didn't until the government stepped in and negotiated that they do so. That kind of flies in the face of a lot of, I would say, basic economic policy as I've understood it being presented. Supply and demand, that when demand is there, then you gear up to produce, to make the money. And when demand is gone, then you try to adjust and tighten your belt until demand returns again. But the degree to which, the supply chain issue, which I never paid attention to, but was so critical and demonstrated to be so critical in how things are set up because of the way companies have set things up, while most of us were just enjoying the fruits of that. They were set up in such a way where there was no oversight, no general framework. And I'm not, for government bodies. I think the conservative tendency to decry all government institutions as, being outside the scope of the founder's intent and the Constitution, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of those claims, I think, are simply, well, they highlight the title of this brief discussion, which is, I can already tell, is going to go a few minutes longer than I intended. But context matters. This isn't 1776. This isn't a fledgling country with just a few 100,000, a few million people, maybe a quarter or more of whom are enslaved. This is a land of 330 million plus people with thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions more visitors and residents, temporary, permanent, known, unknown, etc. I mean, it's a different world, and to try to insist on looking at the world today in the same way it was looked at in the 18th century, I think is a mistake that eliminates our ability to identify what problems exist today and how they can be addressed in ways that will maintain the ideal individual liberties and freedoms on which our nation was founded, while recognizing that there may be new responsibilities or opportunities that may or may not have become responsibilities to establish a social order, to function in a social order that is radically different, that calls for a radically different approach than simply saying move west. So when we think about supply chain issues and how that bottleneck developed and how there was no response to, we got 10 ships in the harbor, it's going to take 5 weeks. We got 20 ships in the harbor, it's going to take 20 weeks. We've got 100 ships in the harbor, but we're still going to operate as if it was 3 years ago. We were moving everybody through within 2 days. That's a problem. The market doesn't fix everything. Business, in fact, often acts in self-interested ways because the name of business is business and making money for the owners. Ownership of businesses, again, as I understand it, through stock markets and other group vested interest is no longer tied to the individual who, say, owns a plot of land that has a creek running through it and puts a mill on it so he can grind more wheat into flour. And now all of a sudden he's got a business developed like you had in the 18th century. I mean, the whole framework is different. And we keep insisting, I would suggest, many of us keep insisting on acting as if, in fact, it is the 18th century. Others of us insist that we don't have to act like we have any relationship at all to the people of the 18th century. And yet, as human beings, some of the same basic issues, and I would say obligations and responsibilities, individually and corporately, pertain to us today, just like they did in the 18th century, which was the foundation for much of the American Revolution and was the foundation for many who sought to, throw off the shackles of government involvement in their lives. Unfortunately, at the same time, shackles were still being thrown around the ankles and wrists and necks of individuals to achieve ends and deny them the very freedoms that our founding documents enshrined as being inherent to us as human beings. And that's a whole another topic, several topics actually, that we'll look at later. But given where we're at today, to what degree do people on both sides of the political aisle find their idealism being taken advantage of by those who are going to work the system to their own ends, and even if they spout or pretend to operate in the interest and with the same ideals of those who are providing support, so that we end up with Democrats and Republicans split roughly evenly now. It's a matter of who gets the most votes out on election day as to who's going to govern the next cycle. And then the next cycle of governance ends up being simply a chance to start spending hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars investigating the other side again, when nothing effective is done legislatively to facilitate our being the best that we can be as a nation, and a nation of individuals who are seeking to be the best that they can be, however they understand, whatever the diverse ways of understanding what it means to be the best individual possible. Which again, because I think I mentioned it in the previous video, um, your idea of an individual, my idea of an individual, and what we should be seeking to achieve, etc., may be very different. One of the ideals of America is that we can both pursue those differences. One of what I think ought to be the practical realities of America ought to be that we then reap the results, good or bad, of our different pursuits. And then one of the options is that in the context of America, there may be institutions available to assist us or through which we can provide assistance, as the case may be, to assist others or to receive assistance from others. When we find out that our approach was better or worse, then there's opportunity for change and reversal of direction, et cetera, et cetera. But the point, and I've got notes here, but I'm still kind of rambling. One of the points, and I'm just going to try to give a few bullet points now and wrap this up, but a few of the things that I've become aware of recently is that trust in the general policies proclaimed by either party in the way things have gone over the last, say, 50 to 75 years, particularly post-World War II, has brought us to a point where I think a vast majority of Americans, bringing and talking about people from both political parties, have been taken advantage of by leadership that doesn't change very often, that may have started out and may even in some ways still be trying to pursue the ideal goals that most of us as lay individuals have in the context of government, etc., but that have been captured by special interests that have ended in results that may not have been intended, but I would suggest are becoming increasingly harmful. And our effort to address and redress those issues is hampered by our insistence on claiming allegiance to policies and principles that in fact are not actually being applied in the context of government and business polity, et cetera, as it's being practiced today. The degree to which this baby formula issue, and I believe the name of the company is Abbott Industries, and if that's wrong, I apologize, but the degree to which I saw some reporting this week, that company, rather than investing in upgrading its facilities, actually distributed um, profits amongst the ownership and management and upper management, so that now we have this baby formula crisis spawned in part by mechanical failures of the system, which allowed bacteria to grow and be spread and actually kill two babies. Again, as I understand the reporting, we'll see how it all plays out. But the degree to which that is true shows how free market capitalism doesn't actually provide a check and a balance on everything, and certainly not opportunities that we all, not just those who are rich and powerful and in positions of leadership of these major international companies, that we all are subject to and prone to given the chance. And so the degree to which maximizing short-term immediate profits at the cost of long-term investments because of the way our current business environment is structured is a problem that needs to be addressed. But rather than our politicians addressing that, they're spending time fighting over who did what when and who knew what when, so that there's no time for effective governance to take place. I think the idea of antitrust legislation and activity needs to be revived. For a long time, I didn't think that companies should grow as big as they want to grow. But the problem that we now have, we've seen it in the meat packing industry, we see it now in the baby formula industry, is that when you get too much concentrated in too few hands, when one of the hands drops the ball, then everybody suffers for it in a way that would be less noticed, less magnified if in fact there were more hands and more balls that were being juggled to try to meet the needs in our market, in our economy. So that a few years ago, it was determined that some banks, et cetera, institutions, auto dealers, et cetera, manufacturers, I should say, were too big to fail and they had to be rescued. I didn't agree with it then, and I disagree with it even more now. I think we ought to be thinking about things that are getting too big not to fail, that there ought to be, in fact, a forced downsizing. And I'm not saying that I have any magic number or idea, how big is too big, but to act like there isn't room for discussion, I think does a disservice to the immediate context in which we live in, the recent history that we have lived through, and the fact that, today in 2022, it sounds like we're dealing with some of the same major issues, housing market, stock market, et cetera, that we were dealing with in 2008. And I think I see a lot of the same faces in the news reports and analysis today that were present in the news reports and analyses in 2008. What has fundamentally changed? So, I want to wrap this up. There are a lot of things. And the last thing I will say is this Ukraine war. I mentioned it recently. This $40 billion package that has just passed. It seems like we've lost our mind with all these off-budget, instant, multi-billion-dollar payments being made for situations that are bad, but at what cost to the future? Not just of those situations, but of our own context as America and Americans, particularly, again, when there is some evidence that I've seen that suggests that, the Pope may have been right. NATO may bear a large responsibility for setting up the conditions where Putin felt justified whatever we think about Putin and his state of mind, where he felt justified in launching the war in Ukraine. I don't think that was justified, but the degree to which NATO and America set the table for Putin to think that he was justified, those questions need to be asked. Those issues need to be addressed. And again, I think we've overreached. John Mearsheimer, I said I was going to mention some names, and here I am at the very end. John Mearsheimer is somebody whose thinking I've seen recently in some discussions, some lectures. Very interesting ideas. And one reason I think he's so interesting is that what he talked about several years ago is now taking place. And so what he said and what he says, I think bears paying some attention to. But there are a lot of ideas out there, a lot of issues, which is one reason that makes it so hard to work through things. And that's why we tend to focus on sound bites and just pick two or three things and say, this is how I think. And if somebody else thinks like me on this and doesn't stray too far on other things, then I'm going to vote for them, whether or not they ultimately have my or our as a nation's best interest at heart. But that's where we're at. So anyway, context matters. I hope to look at the context of some of these ideas later. Thank you very much for your time. And I look forward to speaking with you again soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.